The white-haired lady, along with her brother, enters the hall and catches admiring glances. It was young Mr. Felix, Chamberlain, and Claudia. In the middle of all this hall also stood three men thoughtfully. And then the protagonist reached out to Claudia and told her that she had to choose one of them. But then the latter was madly surprised by such a thing. Then the protagonist calmly explained that she had to choose a groom, but there was only maddeningly surprised and didn't understand why she would do that. The heroine is shocked, running closer to her thought that if now the girl does not choose a groom, these three determined men will kidnap her and hide her somewhere. But she could not tell me about it, so she just said that everything has its reasons. Then began to tell a little about each groom. The first was His Highness Crown Prince, who would become the master of their empire. If Claudia chose him, she would become the empress of this country. But he, looking at the girl, decisively declared that she should become his. It was Lucas Darry and Rexton. But looking into such a determined, unpleasant face, Claudia only sank. Then the protagonist calmed her down and pointed to another young man. He at this time corrected His Highness and said that it is more correct to say that Claudia belongs to him. At this time, the protagonist told that Kalail is a city of Hausa, in which, as everyone knows, crime is rampant. And it is said that His Excellency holds all the power of the place in his hands, so that if she were to marry him, her wealth and power would be as great as the wife of the crown prince. It was Benjamin. But looking carefully at the young man, Claudia only informed him that she wasn't interested in criminals at all. Then she asked her to look at the last man and told her that he was a hero of the empire, a holy knight. And there were rumors that after religious reform clergy could marry too. His name was Constantine. But upon seeing him, Claudia reacted violently and shouted that it would be too disrespectful if a paladin who had worshipped a god all his life would throw away his beliefs and marry someone. The main character looked at her in horror and wondered how she could make such outdated assumptions, then informed her that she definitely had to pick one of them. Seeing such an angry face of the protagonist, Claudia calmly announced that she would like to say something, then resolutely stated that she wanted to live her whole life with Irene. It seems that no one expected such a turn of events, so everyone, including her brother, was simply shocked. And the protagonist at the same second signed her own death sentence. Looking into the faces of the three men that watched with great menace, she immediately remembered that she had already been reborn in a romantic fantasy for a year. And it just so happened that she had seduced the main character. Irene, or rather her past version from another life, was an incredibly capable girl, and she also had the ability to seduce anyone. But even in this ability was a minor disadvantage. She could seduce any person of her own sex, so around the main character there were always a lot of girls. And also from the school years themselves, the main character had her most favorite story, and it was the story of a flower blooming on a withered branch. This story was a romance and fantasy novella. Due to the genre's tragedy treated negatively, this book was known as a violent novella. Opening the first page, the reader will not be able to fall asleep until they have read all the way to the end. Therefore, the protagonist more than once reread the story and cried. She was insanely sorry for the protagonist, Claudia, and she mentally promised that she would treat the girl much better. Once the protagonist could not stand it, she even left a message in a fan group dedicated to the novel. However, that didn't mean at all that she wanted to be reborn in the story. She became Irene, the eldest daughter of the debt-ridden Viscount Ember, and in the story of Flower Blooming on a Withered Branch, the girl is the protagonist's friend after. Checo dies after being caught in one accident. So Irene was well aware that she needed to avoid the main character in order to survive, because although she was just a character in the novella, but wanted to die. Then the girl remembered that she was managing her debts as best she could and living in poverty. Claudia Chamberlain appeared and became a light to her, and it was only because of their friendship that the girl paid off all her family's debts. And so the protagonist, in gratitude, decided that she should repay her, and for the rest of her life be a person that Claudia can use according to her need, and always be there for her and support her. But now Irene asked Claudia if it would be dangerous for her to declare her desire to remain unmarried. She was only surprised and wondered what the danger would be. The protagonist only thought about the fact that it would be insanely dangerous for her life. But Claudia only happily ran up to her for a hug and informed her that such a frightened protagonist looks crazy cute and chipmunk-like. But the protagonist only grudgingly thought that Claudia would do well to notice what was going on around her. And then she began to tell me that among the novelties of this season in the atelier, she found a dress that would fit her perfectly, and she would definitely like to give it as a gift. She asked if the protagonist would like to try it on and smiled slyly and said that her friend was very kind, so she would have to agree. And Claudia knew that when she smiled like that, Irene couldn't help herself and always agreed to everything. But looking at such a sleek face, the protagonist realized that she could live her life only if the girl would date someone, and so she absolutely did not understand why the protagonist of the novel continues to increase her interest in her. And did she really want her to accept her fate described in the original story, and died as she believes her role? But the next moment there was the displeased voice of the prince, who inquired whether Claudia was seriously declaring that she was going to live her whole life with it. Upon hearing such a thing, she immediately hid the girl behind her back and gave the prince an insanely displeased look, while he continued to say that he really hoped Claudia had just made a mistake and he had misheard it. And then, looking at her with the most intimidating look possible, he told her that if it turned out to be wrong, he couldn't stand it until he had wrung the neck of his weak little friend, and he reached out his hand to hurt her. But at that moment, his hand was struck by Claudia with a loud clap, who said that even if the emperor himself tried to harm her, she would not sit idly by, and he dared not touch her. Well, then Veniamin entered the conversation, who with a sly smile said that the daughter of Amber's family is a very unexpected choice because of her father's incompetence. She almost became a slave in exchange for bail. So it was very interesting why the girl chose her. But looking at his sleek face, Claudia asked His Excellency angrily if he was now threatening Irene in front of her. But he calmly said that it seemed strange enough to him that they were so close, and perhaps it was the power of love. But suddenly behind the backs of the protagonist and Claudia was heard the voice of Constantine, who, angrily looking at the protagonist, said that if you use the sacred power properly, you can also kill a man. And Irene was scared out of her mind, and Claudia, angry at all the men, tried to calm her down. But suddenly her brother stood in their defense, who put his arm around his sister and Irina's shoulders and told all the men with a smile that they should know their measure. It's out of line. And also said that he had no idea why everyone wanted Claudia so badly. But Claudia didn't belong to anyone, so they should respect his sister's opinion. Looking at his confident face that inspired respect, the young people began to listen. And Claudia grudgingly remarked that only Irene and her brother always listened to her opinion. After which she said that she absolutely dislikes all three men, so it's not enough to tell them that she just likes them, because the three of them are oppressive and intimidating, and she doesn't have a thought to respect their opinions, because they all just act like barbarians and savages. And only Irene can completely own and understand her. So she wants this particular girl to be with her all her life, after which decisively turned around and led the protagonist away. And afterwards, when I was at home in tears, I asked the main character why those three horrible men were talking about some kind of love and wondered if love is disrespect for another person. She thought it was just a lust for possession because they want to win and take the trophy, and she doesn't want them to continue to think of her as such and just wish they would finally leave her alone, because she could never love such horrible people even if she died. But she explained with her eyes red with tears that they were all insanely disgusting to her, because their looks and behavior literally spoke for themselves, and they were insanely unhappy that they wanted to give her love and she dared to refuse. Looking at the girl, the protagonist stated that this is the protagonist of this novel, and those three men are the protagonists. So she thought that the girl in any case will be with one of them, even knowing perfectly well what kind of people they are. And then she realized that in all likelihood to save her life in this novel, she wanted to destroy her life. She then approached Claudia and apologized for continuing to insist that she commit. She calmly explained that she was not the kind of person who would do that for no reason at all, and she believed that she had the circumstances to do so. Then she said that if the girl was really sorry, she could just hug her. Irene had no time to answer, but Claudia embraced her in a tight hug and was overjoyed to hear that she really liked her. But after moving away from her and in shock, I realized that I had done something terrible because she had just not gotten her permission for such words and actions and seemed to feel insanely guilty. And the protagonist just looked at her calmly and wondered if she'd just realized it. But I assured her that it was all right because it's a pretty good situation for that kind of behavior. But suddenly, unexpectedly, Claudia turned to the main character and asked if she wants to spend her life together as best friends. And the girl, of course, did not refuse because madly valued Claudia. But afterwards, she mentally realized that it seemed her fate in this world would end rather miserably. Then she remembered Felix is Claudia's only brother, and he is also the eldest son of the richest noble family and the youngest deputy minister of the magic department. And he is a genius born with incredible mana and amazing magic abilities. And he also easily enhanced his reputation with his sincerity, gentle character, and outstanding leadership qualities. And like most of the protagonist's brothers, he has a sister complex. So he's about as unfit to exist in this world as a unicorn. But running out of her room, having managed to cover herself only with a blanket, the protagonist absolutely did not understand what this unicorn was doing in the front yard of their house, and she ran frightened, not even knowing what to expect. At this time, the young man cheerfully sat and played with a small black cat holding out a twig to him. But the appearance of the protagonist did not go unnoticed for him, so he apologized for appearing so abruptly came and said that he had no manners at all. The protagonist, looking into his mesmerizing face, simply became numb and reported that everything was really okay. At that moment, the protagonist remembered that she had a disease. When a person of the opposite sex was in front of her, her face would become stony and her speech would become violent. Because she had been in women's middle and high schools, and also in a women's university, this disease became even worse. That's why all the men who spoke to her always asked about it. So Felix Chamberlain asked as she was angry, but the protagonist as calmly as she could let it be known that she can't be mad at beautiful people, and everything is really fine. But the next moment he smiled, literally shining, and said that in that case, he would have to thank his parents, who gave birth to him with such appearance. And looking at this shining face of the protagonist thought about the fact that these brother and sister miraculously able to heal people. And she really felt better, so she more calmly reported that they really hadn't seen each other for a long time, and wondered if the man was still diligently cultivating resistance to magical power. Then the protagonist remembered that in the original story, Felix Chamberlain was the sacrificial sheep of the three male protagonists, and around the time of the climax of their attempts to get Claudia into their hands by any means necessary, he decided to take advantage of the soul unification and isolate her using a relic with the sealed magic of an ancient demon, which could be the cause of the destruction of the entire world. And Felix Chamberlain stood at the crossroads between destroying the world and sacrificing himself. He took with his body the full power of the demon and found himself completely succumbing to it. And so the whole family was destroyed. After using Felix, the three main male characters got rid of him and pretended to be saviors and rescued Claudia. But remembering this whole picture, Irene decided that she didn't care at all what happened to her, because the only thing she wanted was to prevent at least this tragedy. So earlier there was a conversation between them, and the protagonist, turning to Felix, sincerely asked him not to tell anyone and continue to train resistance and magical power. Then she thought she had no choice but to ask for it. Otherwise, he and his sister might get hurt. But the young man just smiled happily and agreed, thankful that Irene had noticed his weakness and informed him that learning was something he sorely missed, even when he thought he already knew everything. And then the girl thought that even though she might have been a little rough with him at that moment, but he really was like a white flower angel who didn't get angry with her, but on the contrary. But suddenly the voice of a young man who said that she was sleeping so well, so he just did not want to wake anyone up. But he didn't explain. He just said that he assumed that this time she had hired a new maid again. She, looking into the young man's smiling face, didn't understand why he was talking about it and just couldn't say it directly either. But the next moment he, looking at the protagonist, calmly explained that the servants had been bribed and the protagonist was now poisoned. So the lethal dose had been exceeded and she would soon die. She looked at Felix in shock and couldn't believe it and wondered if she really had to die now. So she asked how much time she had left. But Felix Chamberlain absolutely with a calm expression replied that she had 4 days left. Then Irene realized that apparently these three crazy men of the protagonists have already started to act, but distracting her from thinking Felix Chamberlain said that they have earned 4 days to think of something, because if he was not around, the protagonist would not be in this place. At this moment, the girl still couldn't believe that she was going to die very soon. Seeing such a frightened expression on Irina's face, Felix Chamberlain calmly explained that there was no need to worry so much, and then with a happy smile asked her to come closer to him so that he could neutralize the poison that was in her body. The protagonist, looking frightened at the young man in front of her, wondered if he was really able to disarm him and did not understand why he was scaring her all this time. But he just laughed, seeing her fright, and said that he could really do it, which was not strange. In the end, the protagonist took a few more steps towards him, but the man only laughed and told Irene that she was still too far away, and he couldn't remove the poison because he had to personally touch her. But she only smiled awkwardly and started to move closer. After that, he took her hand in his and concentrated, causing a flow of mana around, and said that Claudia had also said more than once that it was unpleasant enough when he looked down at someone, because he looked like a pillar. Irene would not answer anything and wondered why and when Claudia had said such a thing. But Felix Sibling calmly continued that Claudia had been as beautiful as an angel since she was a child. So she had been kidnapped several times, and at some point people started courting her, falling in love at first sight. And it was often the case that if it didn't work on her, these people tried to use magic or power. Although Felix Chamberlain was able to sort it out on his own and resist it for a long time. After looking at the protagonist carefully while still cleansing her body of the poison, he told her that he had warned Claudia earlier that he would take care of it, and assured her that she didn't have to worry about anything. Irene was only excited and wondered if it was because of her that everything was completely ruined. And Felix Chamberlain made sure that this was not the case at all, and they should have told Claudia from the beginning not to tolerate such a relationship. So it was his fault that her self-esteem became low. But Claudia also changed a lot, and all thanks to the fact that the protagonist was beside her. Looking at the young man in front of her, she calmly explained that it seemed to her that society would dislike her for such behavior. But Felix Chamberlain calmly reassured the protagonist and said that now Claudia looked happier than ever. And that was enough, since it was the first time he had seen a girl shine so brightly. After that, he pulled back and, looking carefully at the protagonist, reported that they were finished and asked if she was not hurt, but that only excited. Looking at my hands, I was madly surprised and embarrassed, thanked the young man. But Felix Chamberlain, looking directly at her, said that he was very worried, for Irene was crazy unprotected. And he thought he even understood the reason why Claudia had been so sensitive and asked to bring her to the manor after their first meeting, because Irene was insanely sweet. But after reaching out to the protagonist, he asked if he could kidnap her for a little walk together. Eventually, some time passed, and when the protagonist was at home, she was immediately approached by Claudia, who jumped on her from the doorstep and hugged her, saying that she had already learned the latest news, and she had no idea that these despicable boorish people, who would not be enough just to kill, would begin to act so quickly. Then Claudia clenched her hand into a fist, which caused a huge fright of the main character, and said that they dared to try to kill her Irene, and she will find them all right away and twist all their joints, because they all just lost their minds and should have gotten rid of them from the beginning. But the older brother got into the conversation, who, a little embracing the protagonist, pushing closer to his sister, said that it seems to him that revenge can be dealt with later, as now they can cheer up a little. Irene survived such a serious situation carefully. After looking at the girl, Claudia immediately excitedly said that she was very wrong, asked if the main character was not too scared. But the girl calmly explained that now that she had become an enemy of the people, she understood and began to suspect it, but just did not expect that everything would happen so quickly. A flustered Claudia, looking at the protagonist in front of her, asked her not to talk like that because she was absolutely innocent of anything. Irene responded by saying that she realizes all the bad and were those 3 men, so now she will be busy being happy every day. So she needs to save her strength and not waste it on people who don't deserve it. And Claudia asked if she wanted to have fun. But the next moment, without waiting for an answer, she immediately took Irina's hand and pulled her somewhere, saying that she had a lot of things she wanted to share with the protagonist. And the one joyfully absolutely did not resist and was insanely happy with this attitude from Claudia. In the end, when the protagonist went into the hall, it was richly and luxuriously decorated with various delicacies, as well as carousels, and she absolutely did not understand how it all happened and how it all got here. But the girl calmly explained that it was her gift, which she had prepared especially for her most beloved friend. But when the protagonist saw such a flustered, ambiguous reaction, she worriedly asked if she didn't like it, and seemed to look very upset. And even Felix Chamberlain looked worried. But looking at the two of them, Irene just couldn't tell them that it was too much. So she just told him that what they had done for her was enough. But the next moment, Claudia said that she had also prepared a separate room with dresses for Irene, and if she left them here, it would look too careless, so she asked if they could go to see that room. But the next moment, a young man entered the conversation, and looking carefully around the room, he said that it would have been much better to build a river and connect it with an artificial waterfall and put a boat in the middle of it. The protagonist, looking at the young man, didn't understand why he was talking like that, or if he had lost his mind at all. But Felix Chamberlain only added that it would be better to do something less complicated, and it might be worthwhile to have a track where small trains could run. But his sister suggested that they start by ordering a carriage with magic wheels. But at that moment, the frightened protagonist got into the conversation and asked them to stop and said that she was not displeased in any way, and she really liked everything. She had never seen anything like that, so she was shocked. But at that moment, she noticed in front of her insanely sad two young men, who reported that, to their great regret, they knew absolutely nothing about the girl. After all, she had always listened to their stories, and they could rely on the protagonist's help in everything. But she had never said anything about herself. And Claudia tearfully told him that she too wanted to know what Irene liked. And then she, seeing her friend like that, literally burst into flames. And in one breath, she said that the best companion in her life is money because she loves it so much, and there is a big difference between stuffing her stomach with rice or snacks. She loves food and knows a lot about it. She also loves beautiful people, and she likes to look at their faces so she can look at them all day long. She also likes to relax with all her friends around her, and she loves toys. And the best thing in the world for her is to sleep with her arms around something soft. And then in all seriousness, she said that as a child, she dreamed of being a rich, unemployed woman. And afterward, she fell to the floor, and that in one breath told all her life. But looking at such Irene, who seemed to be madly sad, Claudia wondered why she was so anxious. For she wanted absolutely nothing from her friend, and she only wished that she had been near and had come to them. But the girl only tearfully wondered if Claudia wouldn't care, even if she became an insect that only eats and spends money. But she only smiled madly and bowed, giving her a hand to stand up and saying that she didn't care even if she was an insect that only ate. After all, it was enough for her to have Irene by her side. And since she was a rich beauty, she must be her ideal type, and asked if that was true. Looking at such a beautiful lady in front of her, Irene wondered in tears why the girl was asking such stupid questions. After all, of course, she was the most beautiful to her. But afterwards, Claudia wondered until when Irene would address her so rudely, meaning that she still called her by her full name. Then Irene only joyfully jumped up tightly from the day into her friend and informing her that she was the best, addressing her by her shortened name. Watching this all smiling sweetly was her brother Felix Sibling, who informed her that this was the sweetest thing he had ever seen. And this event is insanely valuable in itself. But suddenly, a little later, the protagonist was on the phone and was asked if she was going to live in that house for the rest of her life. She calmly said that she probably would. Then Liam, who was now on the phone, asked how old Irene was and why she continued to run away from home even at her age. But she calmly explained that she had not run away at all, but had moved to another family, and she wanted to say goodbye to the life she had before. Liam only said that apparently the main character had managed to win Claudia's heart and wondered what she had done to her family, that even her brother could love her. After all, he did not understand how it was possible, although he assumed that it would happen someday. But the protagonist calmly explained that Claudia and Felix Chamberlain were attached to her, and because she was nice, at least that was the reason they gave her. But Liam was madly surprised and said that he had long thought that Irene had become strange, but he didn't understand since when she had also become spoiled. But she calmly said that only their father had been spoiled because he had sold his family for collateral, and it was something she was going to take advantage of and completely sever all ties. Then she told her brother that as soon as he graduated, he could come and live here too, because Claudia had given her permission, but her brother only replied that he would think about it. Felix Sibling came up to her and smiled happily and nodded at that moment. Irene told her brother on the phone that Felix Sibling also said that he would always be happy to have a talented person like her brother. But he only praised Irene for having a great knack for taking advantage of the situation and said that they would be in touch later. At that moment, Felix Chamberlain approached her, and the protagonist asked if he hadn't gone to bed yet. To which Felix Chamberlain calmly said that he had just read a little, and that's why he was out so late, and asked who she'd been talking to all this time. To which Irene calmly explained that she was with Liam, her younger brother, who was very energetic and brave from a young age, and afterwards asked if Felix had any business with her. But then he looked at the heroine, who seemed to be worried sick, and told her that he wanted to talk to her about magic resistance. After that, he asked her not to get so tense, because when she was tense, she always got triangular. And then he decided to get to the point and wanted to know why the protagonist had asked him to do it. But she, still nervous, explained that she wasn't sure if the young man would believe her. But in fact, about a year ago, she had received something like a prediction. Then they came to the library to discuss it, and Felix Sibling excitedly said that he realized that such a conversation could make Irene very confused. because if he were her, he would feel exactly the same way. And he began to think about a smaller sacrifice for a bigger one. And then he stated that because the main character was talking about it, it seemed like something grandiose. But she only excitedly asked if he was ready for it, even if no one would remember his sacrifice. And even as she said that everything he had achieved during that time, and even his life, would be ruined. But he calmly agreed. The girl, agitated, looking at him, did not understand such a decision and suggested whether his opinion would not change from the fact that such self-sacrifice will forever remain for Claudia a huge wound on his heart. But he sadly said that even if it would be the result of his sacrifice, he still hoped that Claudia would be able to live her life with dignity. Then the protagonist, literally with tears in her eyes, said that from the beginning, she knew that his answer would be so and asked him to train the restraint of magical power. But he calmly explained that demonic powers don't disappear just because of the presence of containment. But the girl only excitedly wondered what he meant and thought that she had read the novel more than 20 times and couldn't have been unaware of it. But then he calmly explained to her that if there was a power of resistance, it might be possible to disarm the technique imposed by the magic on the ancient artifact. But because of the fact that when spilling out their powers, demons place them and divide their soul into parts, taking them even with the force of resistance, they will invade the person at least half. Then the protagonist, imagining the whole picture, wondered what would happen. But Felix calmly said that it depends on what kind of power the demon will have. But in general terms, demons would never tolerate craving for anything. Irene listened carefully and wondered if that was it, but he calmly explained that all demons are quite dangerous despite that. Then the protagonist, looking at him carefully, asked what he meant when he said thirst. But Felix calmly explained that it depended on the relics, so he couldn't know that now either. Because in any case, because demons are born with a base of thirst, they can't restrain their instincts. Thinking about it, Irene stated that it was all insanely complicated, but then she excitedly wondered if it was possible that she would be under the power of a demon when she told young people she thought about herself, and when she claimed to like beautiful people, money, something tasty. So I asked Felix if it was true that all humans had felt something like this at least once, to which Felix calmly explained that human thirst and demon thirst are radically different. For demons are creatures that kill humans on mere impulse. Thinking about it, Irene asked if Felix was saying that compared to those 3 people doing crazy things to completely possess Claudia, the devil's lust is still much stronger than that and could be much more disgusting. But remembering the 3 creepy people who, by some unfortunate accident, were also the main characters of this novel, Irene said that he had thought about the fact that these people could also be devoured by demons. After listening carefully to her theory, Felix admitted that he had also thought about something similar, and he absolutely understands what we are talking about. But at that moment, he was interrupted by the protagonist, who looked at Felix with all the perspicuity to say that apparently he did not understand anything of what she said, and then asked why she had to tell all this to him. After all, she'd come for the sake of preventing the drama in which he would, according to prophecy, single-handedly take on all these hardships and die, and she did not want Felix to sacrifice himself and simply pass away. For if he did something like that, she would be prepared to follow him to hell with all her determination. But the next moment, the protagonist noticed a kind of surprise in his eyes and wondered if, when he saw such determination on her face, he was beginning to consider listening to her after all. But he only took her hands and told her that during the time he realized why God showed the prophecies to her. But she only excitedly asked if Felix began to believe her, on what the young man with a bright smile said that he really believes Irene. So he asked that the girl try not to get hurt even more, but so only excitedly inquired why he thought she should get hurt. And then he, kissing her hand, said that she was Irene, and because demons stimulate already existing in a person's desire. Then excited protagonist, looking at this whole picture, asked if in this case he could have a desire to hurt her. And he looked at her with a silly look and explained that something similar was likely to happen, but definitely something she wouldn't want to happen. Then asked the girl, in case something happened, that she should let him go, when he wanted to leave of his own accord. But it seems that this did not suit Irene at all, so she looked at the young man with determination and said that he really hoped that she would even contemplate such a thing. After all, she was ready to find a way for all 3 of them to be happy, so he should not leave. She wondered if his words meant that he really had a thirst to torture her, but he awkwardly began to deny it and tried to explain without revealing his feelings for her. But Irene said firmly that he should not tolerate such a thing. It would be much easier if he quenched his thirst before the relic appeared. Felix Chamberlain tried again to explain that it wasn't quite as simple as she thought, but she only wondered what that was about. After all, she had already given her permission, and he could do whatever he wanted. But at that moment, for the first time, his face showed a kind of anger that was not characteristic of him, and he still had a smile on his face and said that the girl should not provoke him. Otherwise, he would scold her very badly and would hardly contain himself. And he promised that he would do his best. Irene asked a little unhappily what exactly he was going to try to do. Felix Chamberlain only said with an awkward smile that they still didn't know what would happen if he continued to be patient and keep his temper. Seeing his awkward face, she again grudgingly wondered how long she had to keep repeating that he shouldn't restrain himself. But the next moment, completely unexpectedly, the guy put her head in his lap and informed her that she shouldn't worry about it, and she could just rest. But the girl was really shocked at how easily he talked about it. And then she thought that his legs were insanely hard because of the muscles and wondered if he was really a magician because it felt like he was working out every night. Then the protagonist still does not rise to his knees, said that she is a little uncomfortable because she has a headache. Felix Chamberlain excitedly asked if she was too high, to which Irene said that his legs were very pumped, and because of that she was stiff. And then she wondered why, despite all this, Felix Chamberlain just continued to sit there, and decided that maybe it was his plan to torture her. But then she thought about the fact that even though Irene was not very comfortable, but still Felix's patting touch began to calm her down, and she immediately wanted to sleep. After that, she thought that although Felix Chamberlain was always very caring, and it also made concessions, but if you look at the whole situation, then in the end, the young man always got what he wanted. And everything happened exactly according to his plan. And at such times, the girl was confused and could not understand whether he was kind and innocent or just was in the mask of innocence. Then the protagonist, as soon as she woke up, saw Claudia crying in front of her, who indignantly asked Felix how they could do such a thing while she was sleeping. And the girl was literally shocked, not understanding such a reaction from Claudia. So she asked why she was crying, but she sobbed and said that she really wanted to be a pillow for Irene too. Seeing Claudia so upset, the protagonist immediately said that as soon as she wanted, she could give her her head at any time. At that moment, Felix Chamberlain intervened in the conversation, and with a sly smile, he asked if she was really in pain, and he was disappointed because she was still sleeping very well. When Felix and Claudia heard this, a dark aura immediately appeared between them, and Claudia asked him if he was going to work today. He calmly pointed out that the sun had already risen, so he was still a long way from working hours, and asked Claudia about her studies. But she calmly explained that she only had afternoon classes today, and her brother was the deputy minister, so he should have gone to work as soon as possible. The young man calmly explained that even if the deputy was late, no one would say anything to him. The girl said that he was just abusing his power. Felix Chamberlain agreed with her words and said that even so, it was not something that could be compared to the girl's absenteeism yesterday. Then informed her that if she didn't study diligently, Irene might be disappointed in her. Then he stroked his sister's head and said that they would see each other later. Irene watched the whole thing in shock, not understanding how Felix Chamberlain could so easily turn the situation in his favor by using her image and then calmly leave. Then Claudia said that she was madly fond of people who diligently perform their duties, but wondered if Irene knew that she wasn't that kind of person, and there really was a good reason for that. Seeing Claudia so frightened, she excitedly took her hand and reassured her that she really knew it and didn't blame her at all, and of course she wouldn't be disappointed in her. But Claudia tearfully promised that she would try, so she asked Irene to hate her. But she was literally shocked by this statement and simply said that even if she died and reappeared in the world, she would never hate her friend or be disappointed in her. She was overjoyed at this answer and seemed to feel better. But suddenly her father came into the room, and Claudia was immediately excited and asked him when he had arrived. But he calmly explained that he had just appeared a little before her. It was Hugo Sibling. Looking at her father, Claudia excitedly informed that she didn't know he was here, so he could have informed in advance. But Hugo Sibling only grudgingly informed that her brother had said the same thing, and then rather lost his head as in a headache and said that Felix Chamberlain was very afraid that someone would wake up. So he put his finger to his lips and asked him to be quiet, and he was shocked that his own son was behaving like that. Then he looked at Irene and for a long time could not understand how he should address her. And first he tried on the words son-in-law and then fiancé. But in any case, he simply addressed her by her full name and told her that they needed to talk and asked her to come in for a private conversation. Looking at such a serious young man, Irene had absolutely no idea why he had come and realized that this was the last day of the life of the man who had stolen his son's heart, though it was not yet fully known, as well as his daughter's heart. Finding himself alone in the library, the protagonist apologized for taking his precious daughter away from him, which has caused some bad rumors to swirl around Claudia lately. But to Hugo Chamberlain's great surprise, he said that Irene had absolutely nothing to apologize for. On the contrary, he should have been grateful that she had made his daughter happier, because she had never been like that before. He said that he didn't know about the other parents, but the most important thing for him was his child's smile. Looking at the excited father, Irene said that he was literally crazy about his daughter and madly in love with her. After that, she asked what reason the man wanted to talk to her, and he said that His Highness the Prince was looking for Claudia, and even though he had been trying to get out of it all this time, she had refused him. This is already crossing the boundaries, and therefore there are two options. Either the prince is going to give up completely and being an intellectual, or he will become mad like a mad bull. The main character listened to the reasoning of Hugo Chamberlain, realized that such conversations apparently they have hereditary. And then after a little thought, the man said that he could no longer cope with His Highness. The protagonist is agitated. Looking at him said that he roughly understands what it is about, and asked what they should do first, and suggested that it is possible to calm him down. Hugo Chamberlain agreed and said that he really counts on the main character, because Claudia is too innocent and simple, which is why she often does things without thinking about the consequences afterwards. So he told Irene personally and asked her to take care of his daughter, and she strongly agreed and promised to protect her. But the man seemed madly surprised when she said protection and asked how she was going to do it. And the protagonist, looking at his face, realized that it was too late for her to practice wielding a weapon to protect herself. Seeing the protagonist's confusion, Hugo Chamberlain explained that all she needed to do was to be near his daughter and to watch and stop her when she did something. After hearing all this, Irene awkwardly agreed. In the end, after some time, the protagonist together with Claudia went to a cave, and she excitedly, looking at the girl in front of her, reported that she was probably insanely stuffy, constantly sitting in the manor, and apologized for her rudeness, as she absolutely did not think about it, and did not even realize that she wanted to go out for a walk all this time. But after she asked what the girl wanted to eat and promised that she would buy whatever she said, Irene was very surprised. But the girl convinced her that everything would really be fine, and it was not a problem for her. And then the protagonist, showing a few items on the menu, said she wanted them. Claudia, just smiling sweetly, said that it was not a problem and they should try everything she ordered. But suddenly, at some point, her face contorted in shock as she noticed the prices and wondered what had happened to them. Seeing this reaction, Claudia wondered if she didn't like it because it was too cheap. But Irene was shocked to hear that she got goosebumps from how expensive everything was. When she heard about it, the girl smiled happily and said that it was all right because it was nothing, as she was really very rich, and promised that she would buy Irene as much as she wanted and could eat. Then the protagonist said that she needed a minute to prepare herself morally, but the next moment she heard the voice of other people who asked and whispered that Claudia had apparently really rejected those great men. And so the rumors were true, and then began to point at the protagonist and wondered if it was the same lady for whom Claudia had rejected young people. The main character only silently and awkwardly looked at her reflection in the mug of tea and listened to the conversation of other people, who were whispering that earlier they were wondering how the girl who was able to get hold of Lady Claudia looked like and how incredible she must have been. However, this girl didn't look like much, especially since she was the daughter of Viscount Ember and was quite famous for her debts. So she herself should have realized better than anyone else that she was worthless in the bride market, for she had nothing but debts, and there was no way to improve her fortune. And so the best option for her survival is to take Claudia into her own hands. And afterwards, they continue to whisper with evil smiles, not understanding how Claudia could so easily fall into the clutches of the protagonist. For though Lady Claudia says that she likes her friend, but Irene is really a great disgrace to her, and then scrutinizing Lady Claudia, and reported that for a long time the phrase, "she is not someone's property," was incredibly popular. so the girls madly wanted to hear in her performance such words. But after the girl calmly turned to the waiter and reported that now in the institution is crazy noisy, and she did not like it and therefore reported that she would like to quietly enjoy time with her companion. But the young waiter awkwardly bowed and said that he was sorry for such a thing and promised that he would deal with it and find a way out of the situation. But suddenly, unexpectedly for the young waiter, Claudia said that it was not necessary and asked if she could take off all this task for the whole day. He was madly surprised and said that it was in the power of only those people who had left a reservation in advance. Even hearing this, Claudia was not confused, just smiled brightly and said that in that case, she wanted to buy the whole cafe and asked how much money would be enough for such a thing. In the end, it didn't take long and the main character went outside with Lady Claudia, and it seems that the girl was madly displeased with this and asked why Irene was stopping her. After all, everything could have been solved much easier, and especially since she wanted to eat in this very cave. But Irene calmly took her hands and explained that they could spend time in the atelier. After that, she smiled happily and said that in any case, she would even be able to tell the atelier to pack everything she had watched before. Seeing such a cheerful protagonist, Claudia's heart seemed to melt, and she agreed. Irene said that Irene was really nice and asked where they would go after they went to the atelier and if she wanted to eat something. She agreed happily and said that since they didn't get a proper meal, they could go somewhere else. But the girl was surprised by her suggestion and wondered if that would really be enough. The protagonist happily convinced her. After another while, Claudia came in with 2 cotton candy-looking bunnies, and they looked insanely cute, just like Claudia herself. Seeing this picture, Irene thanked her happily, and then they walked together with her and talked. Irene praised the sweetness for the fact that it is insanely delicious as it melts in the mouth. But suddenly they were taken out of the conversation by some strange man, who came closer to them, asked if Claudia is a person, or perhaps just an angel or a fairy, because when he looked at her, he had blinding eyes. Irene looked at him carefully in shock, not realizing what kind of disgusting man he was, who smelled of alcohol. But at this time, the man had already approached her friend and said that even her frightened face looked insanely cute. And the protagonist at this time did not see her face, so she was madly surprised that the girl was frightened. But when she looked at her carefully, she saw a face filled with contempt, and she gave him a displeased look and asked him what business he had with her. Irene was shocked, for she had never seen her friend like that before. At this time, Claudia, instead of protecting herself with the barrier, protected the protagonist with it so that the man could not approach her. And he, with his lustful look, said that he approached her because he wanted to get a good look at her face. It was her, and not that immature girl, meaning the protagonist. At this time, Irene, looking at the whole picture, did not understand why she had a feeling as if she felt with her whole body that there was some unknown barrier between her and her friend. Then, not paying attention to those around her, Claudia looked into the insolent face of the man who approached them and informed him that she was not born with such a beautiful face to be looked at by someone like him. And the man seemed to be madly surprised by such a response from her mistress. But in the next moment, her gaze became cold as steel, and she aggressively looked at him and told him that there was only one person in this world to whom she would show her beauty. So she ordered the man to immediately lower his eyes. From such a statement, Irene was really shocked and did not know how to react. But the man that stood in front of her reported that the girl was talking too roughly for someone of her position. But she was calmly inquired whether the man guessed how much his face was hurting her mental health. Then she asked him if he guessed that the others also wanted to look at something beautiful. Looking at Claudia's disgruntled face, the man asked what was wrong with his face. But it didn't go unnoticed by a passerby, which turned out to be Lucas Rian Rexstein. At this time, Claudia, stepping in for her friend, reported that if Irene has not yet grown up and is just a little girl, then the man in front of her is just a decrepit old man. But the protagonist at this time has ceased to be surprised by the behavior of her friend and noticed Lucas Rian Rexstein that carefully watched them and did not understand what he was doing here. But at that moment, the man in front of them just went crazy and looking at him angrily asked how such an unscrupulous girl dared to argue with him now. Then asked if she thought that if he kept saying that her face came out pretty good, it meant that she was starting to be something. The protagonist watched in shock, not understanding what she should do and how to behave. And she had no idea how she could protect Claudia now. But she didn't seem to be disturbed by this and just calmly and coldly continued to look at the attacking man with dignity. But in the next moment, this did not go unnoticed by Lucas Rian Rexstein, who immediately bared his sword and rushed to help the girl. and at the last moment shouted her name, which tried to distract the attacking man. But before he could do anything, a whole crowd of young men in black gathered around the man. Their faces were hidden under masks, and it seems that absolutely no one expected this, including the attacker himself. So he looked around in shock, not knowing what to do. He tried to justify himself, but the next moment his hands were clasped, and he began to be pulled as far away from Mistress and Irene as possible. And they just calmly watched this picture. The last thing this man could say was to ask not to be killed, but absolutely no one reacted to it. In the end, Lucas Darreen Rextins, who could never help felt some awkwardness and did not know how to behave, so just silently, excitedly looked around the picture. But his presence did not go unnoticed, so he was also noticed, and Claudia, who asked what is going on here, and then asked what it forgot here. It seems that such an appeal to the prince in the middle kind of madly hit his ego, and deprived of the gift of speech, though he did not even know how to react. But the protagonist, looking at this whole picture, thought that everything goes exactly according to her plan, and she just wonderfully thought out everything so she could be proud of herself. Then she began to remember that she had started thinking about this plan right after she had talked to Hugo Chamberlain and couldn't decide what she should do to get the three to give up on Claudia and stop stalking her. And then she realized after a few days of thinking that she had an idea, and then she came to the conclusion that at the moment when the male protagonists should appear, she simply should not have existed next to Claudia. But as soon as she thought about it, she immediately realized her uselessness, and despite this, the plan seemed like a great idea. But Lucas spoiled it all, and excitedly approached Claudia, taking off his hood, and asked what the girl was doing here. Because he was passing by and could not even believe his eyes looking at this picture, Irene thought that he is just a shameless impudent if he does that. But Claudia was absolutely cold-blooded and relentless, so turning away from him, reported that she couldn't believe her eyes either. Looking at such a girl, that I wondered where she was hiding all this time, because he almost sent search parties to the estate where she lives and, in general, other houses and lands that belonged to her. But shocking the man in front of her, she said that she was just enjoying a happy time with her friend and was not hiding at all. Then said that Lucas Darreen Rexton can no longer act like that for no reason. But he only laughed in Claudia's face and wondered who would dare to interfere with him. Then told a girl that she was also to blame for the fact that his attempts to contact her were ignored. So Claudia reported that she absolutely couldn't understand why he was so eagerly searching for a man who already had a fiancé. But he only shouted emphatically that in all probability, Claudia really didn't know what she was talking about. After all, earlier he had already said that he loved her and only her alone, and it was not some joke or caprice. After all, their engagement with Irene is just a cover. Then asked her to understand and believe that his feelings for the girl were sincere. After all, their love was not a sin. Even the main character, who was listening to how much the young man was suffering without her and how much he was hurting, felt a huge shame and just wanted to tell him to his face how shameful it looks from the outside. But she held on as best she could. Then he looked at the protagonist with contempt and told Claudia that she had changed a lot lately. Then he said that he was sure it was Irene who had changed her so much, and asked the protagonist what she had done to his beloved. Claudia only approached the arena and put her arm around her, shielding her from Lucas' gift of Rien Rextana, and tried to think of something. But Irene wouldn't let me do that and calmed Claudia down. Then she turned to the prince and told him that since he asked her, she would answer on her own, and told him that Claudia hadn't changed. She was just back to her real self. He only laughed and wondered what kind of nonsense she was talking about with such a serious face. But Irene didn't give up and calmly inquired about the Claudia he knew, as she shrank back, hiding many wounds in her soul. But he looked at Irene and asked what she meant, for the girl was loved by everyone, so she could not have gotten the wounds she was talking about. But Irene calmly explained that Claudia had never changed and had always been innocent and affectionate, for the girl had never once resisted her words. After hearing all of this, the prince asked if she was still saying that Claudia had not changed, but Irene calmly explained that he just didn't like the fact that Claudia had become bolder and had found happiness, and said that in that case he didn't love the girl at all, but loved someone else. But then he, resolutely towering over the protagonist, and asked if she wanted to say that he loved Claudia not as he should. Then ordered that the girl did not dare to give him any advice. But she didn't seem to care at all, so she calmly looked at the young man and told him that if he wanted to get Claudia's heart, he had to do what she wanted. He only grudgingly asked why he wanted to do it. Irene grimaced, not understanding how she could continue to restrain herself and not beat him up for such insolence. But afterwards, she said as calmly as possible that the one who loves the most is always the loser. But at that moment, the prince looked at Claudia and turned to her and told her that if she wanted anything, she should tell him right now, and he was ready to do anything for her and fulfill her every whim. She smiled happily and said that she really had a favor to ask, and said that she really wished that Lucas would never look for her again. At that moment, the man realized what he had just done and who it was because of. So immediately, he called out to Irene, addressing her by name. But she had already managed to hide behind Claudia's back and said that she really deserved to die because she had dared to say something to His Highness that she shouldn't. So she asked him to restrain his anger. But at that moment, Claudia stood up for her and told her that he was being too rough on her Irene, and if he had done everything he wanted to do, they would be leaving. Claudia asked what had happened and who those people were, but Irene calmly explained that she had hired them and had apparently forgotten to tell her. She then explained that they could use a guard who was independent of anyone and whom they had personally hired. But at this point, the girl asked the protagonist if they should learn self-defense, but she calmly said that there was no need for that. After that, they went away happily, leaving the prince behind, and the protagonist explained that from now on, wherever they went for a happy time, they should always take assassins with them. But without finishing the last sentence, she said that they should always take guards with them. But it seems that this went unnoticed by the cheerful girl, who said that Irene was able to solve so easily the question that had been bothering her for so long, and therefore said that her friend must be a genius. At the last moment, Irene happily turned to Lucas Darrian Rexton and mentally addressed him, asking him to realize the situation that he had been rejected and no one wanted him, so he should give up. Eventually, some more time passed, and the protagonist, tired, looked at the calendar and realized that very soon the day of the founding of the state, and thought about the fact that there must be present all the families who received land from the emperor. And because of the fact that the family Chamberlain owns huge wealth, they are obliged to be at the ball. She thought about the fact that the empire had a law that they were forbidden to build a building larger than the imperial palace. And the first head of the Sibling family, who couldn't properly manage his wealth, had built several buildings smaller than the palace. And he even founded and managed a hotel that is slightly lower than the palace. Thinking about all this, the protagonist realized that it was because of such great wealth, the girl could not simply not marry. So Tired thought about how she could stop the prince forever. But suddenly she was distracted from her thoughts by the voice of the maid who, turning to Irene, informed her that her younger brother was on the phone. She rose from her seat excitedly and promised that she would come to the phone. But in the end, her joy at her long-awaited conversation with her brother turned out to be quite different. And he excitedly turned to Irene and told her that she should not be surprised and listen to him madly attentive. That was how she found out that their family had also received an invitation to the ball. But then I recall her younger brother admitting that he, too, thought it was a joke at first. But when he took a closer look, he found an imperial stamp. She wondered what the scum was up to, which surprised her brother immensely. And he asked her what she meant. But she assured him that everything was fine and promised that they would see each other later, since she had to go. After which, recall His Highness thought that perhaps he had decided to actively act to get rid of her, but realized that in all likelihood Lucas thought she would give up that way. But Irene knew she would never do that, and was really determined to make Lucas Darrian Rex down and to spare for the sake of Claudia and Felix's happy ending. As a result, late in the evening, she quietly covered herself with her cloak and began to sneak out of their manor to go out. She looked around anxiously, but then she realized that no one should be here at this hour. She was sharply called by name, which scared the girl very much, and she did not know how to behave. In the end, it turned out to be Felix, who, addressing her by name, informed her that in order for her to grow up, she needed to go to bed early. Whereupon he stood up and approached the protagonist. She looked at him worriedly and wondered whether Felix Chamberlain was being too sincere. She had already stopped growing at her age, and she tried to explain it to him. But he looked at her with a smile and asked what had happened, and she was literally mesmerized by it and did not know how to behave. So she opened her mouth and watched him, unable to say a word. This did not go unnoticed by the young man, who looked at her carefully, still waiting for some explanation. Then she calmly asked if he had any artifact, which allows you to suddenly move. But he calmly explained that teleportation magic can never be placed in an artifact, which surprised Irene very much, and she asked for an explanation. Then the young man calmly said that if you do not determine the perfect exact coordinates, you can safely land in free-flying air. And in the worst case happens, and such that the body does not keep up with the magic. And there are many magicians living with separated body parts. He also added that sometimes they set up inaccurate coordinates and ended up crashing into the wall. But at this point, the protagonist, getting nervous, asked him to stop and informed him that in that case, it would be better for her to just ride the carriage. But he calmly explained that if she needed to go somewhere, he was ready to escort her. But she calmly looked at him and said that it was okay because they didn't want to reveal their place. So maybe they would refuse to meet her if she was with an escort. But suddenly, absolutely unexpectedly, Felix Chamberlain gave her a super attentive look and asked if she was going to meet a man. She looked worriedly, not understanding this reaction, and calmly explained that she was supposed to meet a woman. And the next moment, the guy, brightly glowing and smiling, said that in this case, there would be no problems and clearly felt more relaxed. But after that, he immediately thought and did not know how to behave, which did not go unnoticed by the protagonist, who asked if there were any problems. But he calmly said that he felt a little narrow-minded and asked what she was planning to do about the security. But she calmly explained that she would be protected there. From hearing this, Felix even cracked the glass in his glasses, and he absolutely did not know how to behave. And the main character, looking at this picture, calmly tried to explain that she would behave very carefully and quickly return, so that he would not even have time to notice her disappearance. Then, holding out her little finger to him, she promised him that she would definitely return safely. But afterwards, she looked awkwardly at the young man in front of her, who looked very depressed. At this time, he was thinking that he could do absolutely nothing for Irene and did not know how to behave. But afterwards, he went into his pocket and took out a beautifully shining stone, saying that he would feel better if he was together with Irene. Felix said it was a stone that would tell her exactly where she was, so she should use it if something dangerous happened, because if something happened, he would never be able to forgive himself for it. The protagonist only smiled happily and, firmly rustling the stone in her hands, sincerely thanked Felix for such care, and then the protagonist headed on her way. And I remembered that there are two secret organizations in the Empire. The first is the Veniamin-run Chaos City, and an organization that collects all sorts of information. And unlike the all too familiar underworld in the Silentium, was impeccably classified, so no one knew for sure about the existence of the organization. So there were various assumptions and conspiracy theories, but she read the novella, of course, exceptions. And before the girl met Claudia, she needed to gather all the information in a row. So she reached for the door handles preparing to enter and thought about the fact that earlier she had sold this information that was talked about in the novella, and she did it in order to buy the information she didn't know in return. She smiled happily and went inside, thinking that she was ready to take full advantage of her charm and features. But suddenly in front of her, sitting on a chair, was a beautiful white-haired lady that really attracted all kinds of attention. Seeing her in charge, the heroine glowed brightly and immediately ran up, madly admiring this girl, and was very happy to meet her. Her name was Martina, and this girl was able to seduce the head of the Silentium, after which she summoned the protagonist to her. She ran over and hugged the girl, calling her sister, and then looking at her face, she asked if she had changed the color of her lipstick. She agreed and said it was new. Irene, looking at it happily, said that the color was perfect. Then Martin took the protagonist by the cheeks and kneaded them and told her that since they had not seen each other, they'd become a little bigger, but she only awkwardly said that it was unfortunately the case. She ended up sitting her down on the table, slid a glass of drink over to them and offered her a drink, and wondered why the protagonist hadn't contacted her at all lately. Martin asked if it was because of the beautiful girl Claudia, and Irene confirmed her speculation and said that it was because an unbelievable man had decided to pour his love on her. Irene confirmed her speculation and said that it was because an incredible man had decided to pour his love on her. Then Martina smiled and said that it was probably for this reason that she had almost faced the prince in battle. Then she said that she was unlikely to attend her funeral, and therefore suggested that they should have their last conversation here and now. The protagonist only looked at her unhappily and wondered if she was making such a silly joke, but she said that it wasn't a joke at all and warned that this time she wouldn't be able to help her personally. The protagonist only tiredly exhaled, saying that she understands that she has a conscience. But Martin said that she could still help and said that not so long ago the Duke came to her and asked about the main character. The girl knew that there were a lot of villains in this novel, but in principle they were enough for a tragic novel. So Martin was one of many such villains and played the role of a woman who fell in love with the Duke at first sight, and that was the reason she was helping him. But to put it a little more bluntly, it meant that the simpleton had fallen for his tricks and told him all the information he asked for. And the power of information is often much more powerful than physical information. But the protagonist was well aware of this, so she began to act before Martine succumbed to the Duke's tricks, and got her by taking advantage of her unhappy childhood. This child was filled with loneliness and needs, and also she hid her weaknesses flawlessly and was left completely alone. But after all that happened, the protagonist just came to her and started listening to her talk and experience them. It's true when they say that sincerity works for everyone. And from time to time, the main character was just near the girl, but still received a lot of her love. Although sometimes still doubted whether Martin treats her as a person or just as some kind of animal. Eventually returning to the conversation, the protagonist inquired about what exactly the Duke wanted to know and why the suddenness. And the one, going through her glass in her hands and looking carefully into it, informed that the Duke wanted to know simple and personal information: what she likes, what she doesn't like, what are her hobbies, and so on. All sorts of boring things. So she was insanely surprised. Irene wondered if there was nothing else strange, he asked. But at that moment, she somehow averted her gaze and said that, judging from the fact that the Duke was still contacting her for no reason, it seemed like he was up to something, and that made her very angry and annoyed. And afterwards, she noticed that the main character started to smile at these conversations and grabbed her cheek and asked why she looked so happy. But she only awkwardly started to smile even more. And at this point, I remember my past Martin said that Irene was acting like she was talking to a child, and wondered if she would have had the same feeling with her mother if she hadn't lost her mind. But after she came back to reality, she watched the main character carefully and asked why she had come. And the latter, looking at her excitedly, said that she should have known by now that the girl had received an invitation to the ball. And at this point, she excitedly wondered if Irene had come to ask for her new grave. But she only wondered if Martine had been too rude. And that after coughing after such a shock, she awkwardly announced that she needed some information about it. But then Martina looked closely at the protagonist and asked what was the basis of cooperation. And she calmly explained that the main thing was to give and receive in return. Hearing this, Martin immediately patted the protagonist on the head and asked what she could provide her. Irene promised that she would in turn reveal some information as well. This deal seemed to please her immensely, and she looked back at the protagonist with quite a smile at agreeing to such a thing. As a result, the next day the protagonist walked in a fancy hotel among a lot of outfits and could not decide which one she liked more. After she was dissatisfied and with tears in her eyes, she asked Claudia how long she would continue to choose these outfits. The latter only smilingly said that everything suits the girl perfectly, so she can't make up her mind in any way. Claudia had chosen her dress in 1 second, and she had to try on a whole mountain of dresses. And at this rate, the whole date would pass, and she didn't understand what the point of dressing up was. So she decided to resort to cunning and turn to the woman who helped her with a selection of outfits and asked if she was beautiful in any clothes. She only turned around excitedly. And then the protagonist clarified that she is literally a model who can handle any outfit she would wear, afterwards giving her vanilla working man's gaze, forcing her to confirm the words spoken. But she could not utter anything like that, so she just awkwardly turned away. And the protagonist, with tears in her eyes, thought about the fact that this woman is getting paid for her work. So this behavior is too much. But suddenly Felix suddenly approached her, and with a smile on his face told the girl that she was wonderfully aware, and because of that, whatever clothes she wore, she would look lovely and beautiful. So Claudia couldn't choose anything for that very reason. And then coming closer, he told her that he had come to look and see Irene, but it seemed that he had come too early. But Irene turned to him excitedly and, looking at Claudia, who was still choosing clothes, asked him to stop her as soon as possible. At that moment, he approached his sister, handing her the dress and told her that she could look at it. But she calmly informed him that the dress was peachy and that Irene was more suitable for apricot or coral shades. The protagonist, looking at this picture, did not understand why, despite his request to stop the girl. The guy continued to discuss something with her, but then he suddenly turned to the employee and asked if it was true that Irene absolutely all the clothes fit her very well. She only remained silent again. I don't know what to say, but at this time, Claudia said that Irene always looks gorgeous, and afterwards she asked who made such a dress, for it looked good enough, and she was curious about the name of the designer. Then the excited worker announced that she was the one who had sewn it, and suddenly out of the blue, Claudia announced that she would give her a bonus for such work. And in the next moment, she happily announced that Irene really did look good in everything, so peachy outfits would suit her perfectly. The main character that, in watching all this, realized that Claudio cannot be stopped and just accepted his fate. Eventually, in the evening, they all arrived at the ball, and getting out of the carriage, the young men put the girl in an insanely awkward position, and she didn't know what to do.